Okay, good morning. Today we're going to talk about how atoms form compounds. In today's lesson, we're going to talk about chemical bonds, the basics of ionic bonds and ionic compounds, and the basics of covalent bonds and covalent compounds. First things first, chemical bonds. Well, what is a chemical bond? All right, well, chemical bonds are when two or more atoms are either sharing electrons or they give or take electrons from one another. All right, so compounds are formed when chemical bonds are created between two or more atoms. Chemical bonds form when electrons of two or more atoms are either lost or gained or shared between those atoms. And when electrons are lost or gained, they form ions. Okay? So when an atom loses or gains an electron, it forms an ion, and ionic compounds are formed. When they share electrons, they form covalent bonds, and covalent compounds are formed. Okay? The goal of most atoms is to fill its valence shell, its outermost shell. Okay, and if you remember, the shells we've been focusing on are the K, L, and M shells, the first three. And to fill the K shell, an atom has to have 2 electrons. To fill the L shell, you have to have 8 more. And to fill the M shell, you have to have 8 more on top of that. Okay? So if 2 or more atoms loses or gains electrons, we said, they form ions, and thus ionic bonds and ionic compounds. Okay? And they usually occur between a metal and a nonmetal. Metals form positive ions, and nonmetals form negative ions, meaning they gain electrons. If 2 or more atoms share electrons, they form covalent bonds, and these usually occur between 2 nonmetals. Okay, for instance, hydrogen and oxygen is water, and they form a covalent bond, and they're both nonmetals. Okay, whereas sodium chloride, which we know is salt, all right, that's an ionic compound, and sodium is the metal, and chlorine is the nonmetal. Okay, ionic bonds and compounds. Okay, when an atom loses an electron, it becomes a positive ion. The atom that gains the electron becomes the negative ion. Okay, so atoms that lose electrons are metals, and atoms that gain electrons are nonmetals. All right. So the metals become what we call cations, C-A-T-I-O-N, and nonmetals become what we call anions, negatively charged ions. Okay. These 2 charged atoms form an ionic compound because they're attracted to each other, because they have opposite charges of each other. So the metal gives up the electron and becomes positive. The atom that takes the electron becomes negative. They have opposite charges, and opposite charges attract. Okay? They usually form between a metal in group 1 or 2 and a nonmetal from group 16 or 17. Well, when I say usually, the reason I say usually is because these groups 1 and 2 are the most reactive metals. Okay? Group 1, remember, is called the alkali metals. And group 2 is called the alkaline earth metals. Okay? Group 16 is the oxygen group. And group 17 are called the halogens. And they are the most reactive nonmetals. All right, so group 17 is the most reactive nonmetals. Okay? The metals form positive ions, and the nonmetals form negative ions. We've mentioned that a couple times already. Okay? Unique features of ionic compounds. are that they usually are solids with very high melting points. So it takes a lot of heat to melt them. Okay? Now, covalent bonds in compounds. Covalent bonds are formed when atoms share a pair of electrons. So two electrons are shared between two atoms. So basically what happens in many times is the electrons spin around both atoms. All right? And they're sharing them so that they form a balanced compound. Covalent bonds are usually formed between two nonmetals. Like we said before, H2O. Okay? Oops. Water is formed by a covalent bond. It's actually a polar covalent bond. We'll get into that when we discuss covalent bonds in more depth. All right? Carbon dioxide. Okay? It's also a covalent bond. Okay? Some more examples. Carbon dioxide, CO2. Okay? This is called carbon dioxide. That's the chemical formula for it. Basically, C6H12 is what we know as glucose. All right, it's the sugar that plants produce. It's a sugar. All right, very common sugar. And then you should know this one by now. We know this is water. Okay? So in covalent bonds, electrons are neither shared or gained. All right, so they're neither gained nor lost. They are shared. Okay, so the electrons are being shared between two or more atoms. Okay, and that concludes our discussion for today.